All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning for me. Good afternoon to Dr. Maren Niehoff in Jerusalem right now. Dr. Niehoff, this is your second appearance on Patristicast, so welcome back and thanks for agreeing to come on again.
Great pleasure.
So we are going to talk today about your book, Philo of Alexandria, an Intellectual Biography. I first wanted to talk a little bit about the project of an intellectual biography. This is the second one I'm aware of in late antiquity. John McGuckin has one on Gregory Nazianzus, and then there's yours. Can you talk a little bit about an intellectual biography? What is it, and how did you arrive at the notion of writing an intellectual biography of Philo?
Well, obviously this was an adventure because nothing had ever been attempted in, nothing like this had ever been attempted in Philonic scholarship. And so it was really an adventure that I got myself into. And I started this adventure really at the end of my last book on Homeric exegesis, because after I started the book beforehand, the previous book, by looking at Philo's predecessors, and then I came to his huge corpus, and I was really struck that there is a huge difference between those works that have a kind of a clear engagement with Homeric exegesis and really work very carefully with the text, and those that completely lacked it. And at the first moment, I was really taken by surprise that there could be works of Philo that were basically clean from anything that I could identify as even echoes of Homeric exegesis. And I began to wonder how I can explain this enormous difference. And this was my starting point for looking at development in Philo and to see whether we can explain this difference by different audiences, by different stages in life. And so I began to puzzle together and to look at all his works. And I moved out of the kind of particular question of exegesis, and I tried to get a broader understanding of all his works and see where this issue of exegesis, whether Homeric or much more biographical in general, where this kind of fits in within the whole corpus. And this, again, has really never been done in Philonic studies, except at the very beginning when the critical edition was being prepared. And that's when scholars like Cohen and Wendland, when they actually try to figure out the sequence and the nature of the different works. But it was a rather limited project at the time because they were mainly interested in producing the critical edition. So I tried to put together a chronology and also to identify the nature of the different series on a much broader and on a much more comprehensive scale, which would basically include everything, namely the literary genre, the philosophy, the echoes that we get of Philo's implied audiences. I put emphasis on an intellectual biography as distinct from a normal biography, because we basically know very little, next to nothing, about Philo's life. And the only thing that we really know about his life is his embassy to Gaius in 38 CE. And I worked my whole biography from that point onwards. I took this as the only kind of clear and certain point that I have. And I identified the historical writings, the Legatio and Flaccus, as obviously writings after the pogrom in Alexandria, because they write about the ethnic conflict in Alexandria. So obviously they were written afterwards. And the Legatio also mentions the new emperor, Claudius. So here we have very clear evidence that the Legatio must have been written after Gaius Caligula was assassinated in early 41, namely after Claudius was already in power. So here we have the historical writings as the only kind of clear point of reference that we can date more or less clearly. And my proposition was really quite radical. I wrote the intellectual biography kind of from the end backwards. And many people were really surprised about it, because usually, you know, when you open a biography, you expect to start with the birth of the hero, and then you describe how he grew up and what kind of education he got, and then how he developed intellectually. And I felt that I really can't do this, because I don't really know anything about Philo's birth and his early upbringing, and he very rarely says anything about it, and basically just mentions some studies that he did, but nothing really to reconstruct his early years or his training. And so I said, well, if that's the case, then we should kind of do it the other way around. We should start with the only things that we really know. These are his late writings, the historical writings, and then put the puzzle together by working my way kind of backwards from the historical writings, which have a pretty clear date, and I can also characterize them philosophically. I can characterize them in terms of their literary style, in terms of the audience that Philo anticipates, namely a very broad audience that doesn't know much about Judaism. And then I developed a method to reconstruct, in comparison to these historical writings, a relative chronology. And my criterion was to say that those writings that are similar to the historical writings in terms of the implied audience, in terms of the broad general style, in terms of the philosophy, they are most likely also written in the context of the embassy and after the pogrom in Alexandria, whereas writings that are completely different in terms of the audience that they anticipate, in terms of the the literary concerns and style and philosophy, they must then kind of by implication belong to the early stages. And I ended up arguing that the exposition and the historical writings and the philosophical writings, they belong to this late group, and only the allegorical commentary and the questions and answers belong to the early Alexandrian writings, when in fact Philo addresses a Jewish audience, and he presupposes a lot of biblical expertise and a very deep interest in every single verse of the scriptures. And so I ended up arguing that in a way, most of Philo's writings are in fact written in Rome rather than in Alexandria, or in the context. I cannot prove that all of them were written in Rome while he was still there. And I argued that he must have stayed there at least 3-4 years, waiting for Claudius to get into power, and then continuing the negotiations with him. As far as I can see, it doesn't make any sense to assume that the moment that Gaius was assassinated, Philo would just go home and not try to speak to the next person in power and settle the issue. So
he may have written some of these philosophical treatises in Rome, but even if he didn't, they show traces of his time in Rome and how Roman discourses shaped his thought.
Yes, my argument is that Philo, as an ambassador, radically changed his objectives. In Alexandria, I think he was concerned to explain the minute details of the biblical text for other Jews, and there were many debates in Alexandria about every single verse. And in Rome, he in fact addressed a broad Greco-Roman audience under the pressure of convincing them that Judaism was an excellent philosophy, very suitable to the Roman Empire, and that it should be accepted and protected in the Roman Empire. So my argument is that even if I cannot prove precisely that all of these later writings were in fact still written in Rome, I think that even upon return to Alexandria, Philo still continued his Roman networks and continued to address those audiences that he had in fact set up and developed and cultivated when he was in Rome as an ambassador.
Okay, so you mentioned that we know so little about Philo's own life. I want to situate him a little bit historically, at least for the audience. So he's writing in the early middle 1st century CE. So he was an elder contemporary of Paul and the other disciples. And that actually comes up in your book a number of times in your talk about Philo and his the influence of Rome, because you compare it briefly to the Gospel of Luke and Paul's letter to the Romans. What is going on? You mentioned this now, 38 CE, Alexandria, Egypt. What's going on there that prompted his embassy to Rome? There was conflict that resulted in pogroms, you stated. Can you talk just briefly about that? What's happening between the Jews and the Romans at that time?
It's not so much a conflict between the Jews and the Romans, even though that's often perceived as such. It was a rather local conflict between the Jews and the Egyptians in Alexandria, and in fact, Philo really praises Flaccus, the Roman governor, very highly at the beginning of his administration, and he thinks that as a result of Gaius getting into power, Flaccus lost his power and became weak, and thus also very weak and amenable to the Egyptian nationalists. And Philo very clearly thinks that it's a problem with the Egyptian nationalists. I have recently discovered that there may be a very kind of mundane reason also to these tensions, because Philo very often mentions the gymnasium, and it's very clear that the leaders of the anti-Jewish party were leaders of the gymnasium, and they were connected to these sports events. Now it so turns out that briefly before the tension broke out the conflict broke out in Alexandria, the Alexandrians actually won at the Olympic Games in Olympia. And especially if we look around in the modern world and see what an Olympic victory may do to the fans, it seems quite likely that there is some kind of a connection between the precise date of the tensions and this and the connection to the gymnasium, the sport events, and this victory. As Philo tells it, the spark that blew everything up was King Agrippa's visit in the summer of 38. He came, and this must be emphasized, is usually overlooked. He came because he was sent by Gaius Caligula, with whom he had been raised, and they were rather personal friends, to check out the situation in Alexandria. So the beginning was in fact very, the scales were towards the Jews, with an envoy, an imperial envoy, who was obviously not against the Jews, but on the contrary, he was an advocate of the Jewish cause in Alexandria.
Okay.
So we have this escalation, apparently, as I said, getting out of hand around the gymnasia. And then Philo does indeed travel to Rome in a very precipitated manner, apparently in the winter of 38 or late autumn, when the Mediterranean Sea was mostly closed. And he arrives in Rome as the head of the Jewish embassy, facing the rivaling Egyptian embassy, which was headed by Appion. about whom Josephus writes his Contra Appium.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's a product of Alexandria, Egypt, which is a very cosmopolitan city in antiquity, one of the centers of culture and learning. And he goes to Rome, and I'm going to quote something from the conclusion of chapter 3. I think this really encapsulates the main theme of your book, the main argument. And this is on page 68 for anybody who wants to follow along. And you talk about the Roman context. Quote, within this distinctly Roman context, Philo develops a fascinating new notion of Judaism, which he defines by nobility of mind, the Jerusalem temple, urbanity, and civic virtues. He no longer defines Jewish identity by reference to scholarly activity on the sacred text, so biblical exegesis, as he did in Alexandria, but rather in terms of distinctly Roman values. This dramatic refashioning of Judaism has significant implications for early Christianity and subsequent Greek authors in the Roman Empire, end quote. So let's talk briefly. So in Rome, the Roman Stoicism is starting to emerge as really a dominant school of thought. You got Cicero and
well, Cicero reports about the Stoics. He's not himself a Stoic. He identifies with the Platonic school. Yes, let me perhaps explain. First of all, we have to remember that Rome really in the first century emerges as an intellectual capital of the empire. We often have this kind of very limited vision of Rome as simply a military force that imposes taxes on everybody. But we must remember that Rome in the first century had huge libraries, probably even better libraries than Alexandria. And really splendid scholars such as Varro and others, and many others. I could name many others. And very important to remember as well, Rome operated in a kind of bilingual manner in the first century. So any educated person could easily read Greek, and many also express themselves in Greek, and the Roman libraries were full with Greek books. So we have this kind of very interesting bilingual, bicultural or multicultural atmosphere in Rome that doesn't really have its kind of precise parallel in any other metropolis in the empire, in that richness. Now, my argument is that Philo, in his later Roman writings, provides an incredibly rich mirror of what a Roman audience and what Roman discourses were in fact like in the mid-first century CE. So the themes that he brings up obviously were themes that he thought would speak to a Roman audience. And the ways that he explains Judaism now for a non-Jewish audience were obviously ways that he thought were attractive and understandable for a broader Roman audience.
Can I? Okay.
So, yes, and here comes in Paul, who writes his letter to the Romans, we don't know exactly, but maybe 10, 20 years after Philo's Roman writings. So Philo is in fact the closest and closest parallel that we have to Paul. We have here two Jews who were writing in Greek, addressing a Roman audience, and in addition, explaining to them the biblical heritage. You asked previously about exegesis. So for me, it is extremely interesting that Philo in Rome abandons the style of systematic commentary because that's obviously too tedious and too specialized for a broad audience. And he begins to write lives and to speak in terms of exemplary ethics and in terms of exemplary scenes that really give you the character in a nutshell, or that convey the ethics that motivate the person's life in an anecdote. And it seems to me that Paul works in very similar ways. He's no systematic Bible exegete. There would not have been an audience for this. And he too is very interested in kind of the critical moments when Abraham leaps into faith, or when critical moments that portray the character and the virtue of a person, that he can also convey to his readers. And both in Philo's late Roman writings and in Paul's, especially in the letter to the Romans, you also see a kind of an ethics of imitation. Yes. When the heroes of the Bible are presented as role models, rather than as a text that you need to exegete in a scholarly, or maybe we can even say in a somewhat antiquarian manner. Philo in his Roman writings, and Paul, and certainly also the letter to the Hebrews, they present the biblical characters as kind of witnesses, as models, as exemplary figures, who can be quite easily imitated by the readers, and the readers are invited to identify with them and become like them, or adopt their values as criteria in their own lives.
So I'm glad you talked about that, because you anticipated a question, because you have a chapter on these lives of these biblical heroes, and Philo presents them in such a way that they're quite relatable to some of these Roman intellectuals. And really what he's trying to do here, he's not writing for a Jewish audience, you say. He's writing for these Romans, and he's trying to say, look, Judaism offers very similar manners of life, maybe even superior in some ways to the Romans, but certainly amenable to Roman values. Which is a very appealing argument. And you mentioned here that a little bit later in the next century, you have Christians who are doing almost the same thing, like Justin Martyr and Athenagoras, who are saying to these Romans, look, so we worship this one God who's not the emperor, but really from an ethics perspective, we have a lot to offer the empire, and we're not much different than you guys. So how about a little toleration here? How about cutting us a little bit of slack? Well, Philo seems to be doing something quite similar in a way, but doing it a little bit more in a more philosophical manner, I suppose, showing these Roman philosophers that Judaism offers a pretty good way of life itself. And we can look at this by examining the lives of Joseph and Moses and Abraham. And is that pretty accurate, an accurate summary?
Yes, indeed. Since I'm writing this book, I have moved on, and I can add now a little kind of update my own work. I have started to work on a commentary for the Brill series, a commentary on the Probus of Philo, which is a book on freedom and talks about the freedom of the righteous. And there he again speaks about lives of exemplary figures, but he no longer presents a life as we have it in Moses from childhood to old age, but rather he really reduces it to anecdotes, to mere anecdotes, and he has many Greek and Jewish and surprisingly also Indian philosophers there, and shows how they in fact share the basic value of freedom and commitment to truth, that are defended even at the price of death, even when threatened by tyrants. And the really interesting argument in the Probus is that there is a kind of a barbarian philosophy.
Mm.
And he actually calls it barbarian, and he also draws on the Persians and the Indians, and he says that perhaps these philosophies are less theoretical. They don't have a metaphysics, but they are great at promoting ethics. And in particular, also, they are great, and this is an argument that Christians will later make, they are also great at teaching large populations these ethics. So they don't stay in their ivory tower and their kind of university and only do metaphysics for the really specialized, but they are actually able to get whole nations under this umbrella of ethics. And in that way, they are not only similar to what the Romans do, but they are also extremely efficient, and perhaps more efficient than the Greeks were, who produced high-rate philosophers, but not necessarily whole populations that could in fact live up to it or even read all the things that philosophers had produced.
Yeah, that's a major theme in Origins on First Principles in Book 4, on the interpretation of the Bible. And it comes out in his Contra Celsum too, where Celsus despises Christianity as a barbaric philosophy that's for a bunch of rubes, while Plato, is very sophisticated in Origin response. Well, that's a mark against Plato. Christianity is not this elitist philosophy, as you say, for people in every tower.
That's right. That's right.
So so we've talked about ethics. Now, for the Stoics, especially for Roman Stoics, this section was very insightful for me because I'm currently in this little reading group with 4 other individuals working on Origin and Hellenistic philosophy. And we're reading Origin along with Seneca's Natural Questions, which you bring up in this book. So Isidorus Katsos, whom I think you know.
Yes.
Christian Hengsterman, who I've had on here, Hui Him Ip at Cambridge, and then Sam Pomeroy at Munster. And so I kind of talked about this with these guys and recommended this book because you talk here about natural philosophy. And a text that's particularly important, well, there's 2. There's Philo's on the creation of the world, De Opificio Mundi, and then there's the exposition of the law. And Philo engages these texts through the lens of Roman Stoicism. And so on the creation of the world almost becomes a counterpart to Plato's Timaeus. And he even says at the very beginning of this text, if I'm not mistaken, that readers need to have an adequate grasp of natural philosophy because the Bible, especially the creation story and the law, is consistent with nature. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's a very insightful, I think.
Yes, Philo really presents there a very thoughtful and an interesting theory of law. And he distinguishes between lawgivers who simply say what is forbidden and what is allowed, kind of a list of prescriptions, and then others who prepare their readers for the laws that they're going to follow, and the preparation is of a philosophical kind, namely their minds need to be prepared well so that they're able to follow the rules. And Philo says that Moses, as a lawgiver, obviously preferred the second way because he doesn't start his work in book 1 with laws. They only come in the book of Exodus. And so the creation account in Philo's interpretation is really a preparation for the reader, and in particular, a preparation that shows that the law that Moses gave with divine inspiration was anchored in nature. It was not a willful set of laws. It was something that emerged out of nature. And here he says that the Torah, the written text of the Torah and the written laws of Moses are virtually identical to the laws of nature. Now, many scholars have thought that this is kind of a contradiction in terms. How can the law of nature be something that is written down in a specific book? How can the law of nature be coordinated with the very specific Jewish laws, such as kashrut and Shabbat observance? Are the two not contradictions in terms? And in some ways, in ancient Greek conceptions, natural law was in fact seen as the opposite of the written law of the polis. But in Rome, and particularly in Roman Stoicism, this was no longer the case. And the Stoics in Rome kind of gave a natural, a philosophical underpinning of specific laws, and Roman law, as it was applied throughout the whole empire, increasingly came to be seen as close to natural law, namely as a kind of an underlying law that was applied throughout all the different nations who were seen to have particular laws that somehow have to be coordinated with this underlying, almost universal law. And so the tension between philosophical ideals and very specific instructions was in fact inherent in these Roman discourses. I think this is a classical case where we can see that Philo really was very sensitive to Roman discourses and succeeded in explaining Jewish law kind of on their terms. Because in the only passage in the allegorical commentary from his early Alexandrian times, where he speaks about Jewish law, he doesn't apply these criteria at all. He basically refers there to the tradition, and he says that the Jewish law preserves the Jewish community intact, but there is no justification in terms of philosophy or in terms that a non-Jew could easily understand. And when he comes to Rome, I think he succeeds very well in formulating Jewish customs in a way that would make sense. And very clearly, he also anticipates some of the criticisms that we know were in fact voiced and were circulating, and sometimes even Josephus, a generation later, still refers to those criticisms. Such as the Shabbat being a day of laziness, as Seneca said, or the problem of circumcision, which Tacitus and Juvenal and many others, and Appian, of course, also found really quite ridiculous. And so Philo was able to show that all these laws that to some seem quite arbitrary, in fact, are all grounded in nature. And for this purpose also, he sometimes employed medical terms to show that the service that the halakha does for nature is not a general thing, but is very concretely beneficial in medical terms. So that's as far as he went to go to make this understandable
and that explains why then. So for the Stoics, they have that famous line, their kind of vision, living according to nature, and Philo really takes that up. Of course, he's not fully Stoic. He criticizes their notion of the conflagrations, which at the, these revolving cycles of existence, the heavenly fires that consume everything and then life is reborn again. He kind of ridicules that a little bit. But their notion of living according to nature, he takes up and he says, well, that's a biblical notion. And so then he constructs this philosophy of creation and on the creation of the world in such a way that the Bible itself gives us a natural philosophy to live by. And so this gets into the themes of providence and freedom. And Philo takes up that dialectic quite a bit. And you have this passage here. I'll just quote it here. This is in your chapter on creation theology and monotheism. Philo criticizes the Aristotelian notion of the world's eternity and dismisses it as an impious falsehood. It's a grave mistake, he says, to think of God as inactive, which is Aristotle. Aristotle's providence doesn't extend beyond the heavenly realm. He's kind of disinterested in human affairs. Thus severing the tie between him and the created world. The Aristotelians eliminate a powerful incentive to piety, namely providence, because reason proves that the Father and Maker takes care of that which he has created. It is God's responsibility to, quote, administer and direct everything. This is from Philo's on the creation. Philo describes the nature of God's activity in this way. It is absolutely necessary that among existing things there is an active cause and a passive element, a key element in Stoic physics, and that the active cause is the absolutely pure and unadulterated intellect of the universe, superior to excellence and superior to knowledge, and even superior to the good itself and the beautiful itself. But the passive element, which is of itself without soul and unmoved, when set in motion and shaped and endowed with the soul by the intellect, changed into the most perfect piece of work, this world, end quote.
Yeah, so, that's from the Opificio Mundi.
That's right. That's such a beautiful passage. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because how else to put this here? Perhaps the average reader who reads Genesis 1 and 2 wouldn't think like this when reading that text. They don't necessarily see these Stoic themes emerge in the creation account. Philo does. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, we have to remember that Plato's Timaeus is here in the background, of course, as well. And Philo alludes to it, the Timaeus, when he says that one of the people of old, clearly referring to Plato, distinguished between an image and the model, and that the material world was in fact created in the image of an ethereal model.
But Genesis 1:26. Genesis 1:26, right?
That's yes, in the image of God, man was created. Yes, indeed. But of course, in the Timaeus, you have the world being created after the image. Only that in the Timaeus, the demiurgos, the creator God, looks at a given image of the world, whereas in Philo, God himself creates this image in his logos. So he produces his own idea in the image of which he then creates the material world. So this is the kind of the Platonic background that Philo assumes here or draws attention to at the beginning of his creation account. And then he adds these distinctly Stoic terms, which you have rightly pointed out, about the active and the passive material. That clearly is a Stoic term that we have also. Cicero mentions this as the key terms of Stoic natural philosophy. So Philo kind of combined the two. And in terms of providence, the Platonists had a general notion of providence, that in other words, you have a good creator God who does care for his creation, but his providential care does not filter down to the individual. It remains a kind of a general maintenance of the world. That's what God provides for. Whereas the Stoics thought that also God, in fact, protects the individual, not necessarily his luggage, as Cicero formulated. So you can't complain about God to kind of losing your house or whatever, but you can in fact trust him for protecting yourself, your well-being, in some more personal way than the Platonists in fact thought. But here again, we see that Philo is not very interested in the theory of Stoicism. In his treatise on freedom, where obviously these issues come up with great intensity, he doesn't very much go there into the kind of typically Stoic preoccupation with right choice and the kind of a rational attitude, how to relate rationally to our environment and the different intellectual processes that we may go through. He's not so interested in that, but he's more interested in asserting our freedom, in asserting human freedom at the level of a personal sense, and at the level of kind of every human being has the authority to, in fact, do the things that he or she thinks are the right things to do, and to speak up for the values that we have, even in situations, in life-threatening situations. So there is Philo has an interesting selection here of motifs, and in the Probus, which, as I said, I have become very interested in, we also have kind of cynic motifs. The Cynics were perhaps the earliest promoters of the idea of freedom, and the Stoics probably took it from them, Diogenes being the founder, and he was famous for his parrhesia, for his freedom of speech. He even criticized Plato terribly. He really didn't leave much of him. He was basically very unconventional. So his main idea of freedom was to undermine any social contract or any convention that we can have. And interestingly enough, and this distinguishes him from the Stoics, he also emphasized kind of the physical needs that human beings have as a basis for this freedom. So Diogenes, for example, he would kind of masturbate in any place he would just feel like it, or he would sleep in any place that he felt that he had a need for, and this was a philosophical statement, and it was using his body to convey a philosophical message. And Philo, in the Probus, he tells 4 anecdotes about Diogenes, so he's obviously very central in that book. And there are other parts of the treatise which convey this cynic spirit of non-conformism and challenging social conventions. And it's really interesting that Philo is so diverse. On the one hand, he has a book on providence, and on the other hand, he has this book on freedom, where he's not particularly concerned about providence. So I think he was one of the most read and diverse thinkers in antiquity, and wherever you kind of start digging more carefully, you find that there are so many associations and so many worlds that he related to, that is really quite amazing still, even today, 2,000 years later. And in each particular case, Philo had a very particular way of handling the ideas that he was familiar with to give them a new use, to give them a new interpretation, and to put them together in a kind of in a fresh way that spoke to the needs of people and the intellectual interests of the people of the first century. So I think that and again, of course, the notion of freedom is a huge topic in Paul, and I think that here as well, Philo should be used as a guide to understand his slightly younger contemporary Paul.
And not just Paul, but you also bring up Luke, the Gospel of Luke,
Yes.
which is very informed by Roman discourses.
Yes.
So, okay, we've talked quite a bit then about Philo and the Roman influence. We haven't yet really gotten into the Alexandrian Philo, the more Platonic Philo. Can we talk about that for just a little bit more before we
Yes.
wrap up? Okay, so now we're following you, and we're going in inverse order from Rome back to Alexandria, and here Philo is engaged in traditional biblical scholarship, verse by verse exegesis, but he emerges as more Platonic than Stoic. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that comes out in his allegorical commentary and in his questions and answers?
Yes, I think it comes out particularly in his allegorical commentary. The questions and answers are kind of a handbook, and he doesn't really get very much into philosophy there. It's more a kind of a basic guideline, I think, probably for his students. But in the allegorical commentary, yes, he gets very deeply into philosophy, and basically he interprets via Homeric techniques, he interprets the biblical text to speak Platonic philosophy. Now, we see this very clearly first of all, in the direct quotations. In the allegorical commentary, we have quite a bit of the Theaetetus, Philo's dialogue, the Theaetetus, being quoted in the allegorical commentary in the book called Fuga, on the Flight. And he clearly assumes Plato to be known by his readers, and he completely endorses there the ideal of Plato's ideal in the Theaetetus to imitate God, that ethics is a way of imitating God and becoming like him in his righteousness and in his values. So this he says explicitly. And in addition, we have many motifs that come up in the allegorical commentary that are clearly inspired by Plato's philosophy. Foremost, the dichotomy between the soul and body, and the notion of a tripartite division of the soul, and particularly the notion that the different parts of the soul are in tension, in inevitable tension all the time with each other. So always the more spiritual part fight the more material part, and this is the essence of human life, to negotiate the different parts of the soul. Whereas from a Stoic point of view, the soul is rather more homogeneous, and the idea is to ward off influences and false impressions from the outside world. So if we control those impressions, then we kind of keep out the bad influence of passions and other things that may fall upon us. Whereas for a Platonist, the conflict is an inner conflict of the soul and is never really completely resolved. And it is this tension which really animates the allegorical commentary, and the drama of the different parts. And Philo often uses even the metaphors that made Plato so famous, and namely the horses, and the horse riders who tries to control the horses, So this is very much the drama of the internal soul that animates the allegorical commentary, with very few references to real life. That's one of the reasons that we know so little about Philo's early life, because the allegorical commentary is so ethereal, so spiritual, so philosophical, so much concerned with the inner soul, that he never gets around to tell us what he had for breakfast, or where he's teaching, or you know, who his students were, or what the problems in Alexandria were. He never speaks about these, because he's so much focused on the inner parts of the soul, and that's his main reason. And perhaps really very noteworthy also his saying that Plato is like a companion to him, a companion on the way. And I think that he had a strong sense that the Torah and Plato were kind of marching in the same direction, and conveying a similar truth, calling human beings to transcend the material realm and really gain a higher vision of things. But even in the allegorical commentary, Philo is not 100% Platonist, because he avoids the idea of the immortality of the soul, which is obviously a very important part of Platonic ethics. And Philo doesn't mention that, and it seems quite carefully and consciously so. He doesn't mention it. And I think it has to do with his notion of God being the only immortal being that there is. So the human soul cannot be immortal.
Okay, so the tripartition of the soul, the Platonic notion that there are three different parts of the soul. I had a question about this as I was reading. You don't talk about it, but book 15 of Origen's commentary on Matthew begins with a very lengthy discourse on castration, the eunuchs in Matthew 19:12, and it's a very complex discourse. He starts out with a very more traditional grammatical analysis of the sequence of the narrative, but he brings up Philo a little bit later on. He brings up Philo and Sextus Empiricus critically. And he says, he cites a passage from Philo's on the worse the text, the better. And here's what Philo says about eunuchs. On which account those who are not completely uneducated seem to me would choose to be blinded rather than see things that are unbefitting, and to be deprived of hearing rather than listen to harmful words, and to have their tongues cut out to save them from uttering anything that should be divulged. Then he goes on, it is better to be made a eunuch than to be mad after illicit intercourse. And Origen says, but that eliminates the element of freedom and in the practice of virtue. And I'm just curious then, that sounds like a very Platonic argument that Philo is making, where with the Stoics, it's psychological processes, and external stimuli are oftentimes morally neutral, but it's our assent to these impulses or impressions that emerge. Philo seems to be making an argument here that none of that really matters here. The important thing is eliminating the opportunity for illicit sexual intercourse. I don't know. Could that be more of this tripartition of the soul that Philo is working with there? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I would have to look up the passage again and see what the context is.
Okay. I have the word, just for your reference. It's the worse the text, the better. Section 176. So I don't know. This is something I actually kind of want to develop this discourse from Origen's commentary on Matthew into a paper. So I've been thinking about it. I was curious what your thoughts were.
I would have to look up the
Yeah.
context
Yeah.
exactly and see what Philo says, how he moves towards the statements that you just quoted. Because obviously Origen has an interest in quoting precisely that, and to develop his own different position in relation to Philo. So I would just have to check what exactly Philo meant when he made this statement. So I wouldn't want to.
Yeah, I want to look that up too. I was just curious what your thoughts were, but it is a pretty I think it's an important distinction to make, that Philo that the Platonic ethics were built around this tripartition of the soul, whereas the Stoic ethics, it was more, like you say, a homogeneous soul, not divided into three parts that are always in tension. They were concerned more with psychological processes, it seemed to be.
I think rational. The Stoic approach is extremely rationalistic, because they, in fact, believe that the hegemonikon can control every impression, and therefore also eliminate the experience of passions. Whereas Plato assumed that. Plato assumed that the passions were an inherent part of the human soul that could not be eliminated.
Okay. Yeah. So okay.
So from that perspective, I think that Plato is more psychological, because he looks at the internal conflicts. Certainly, the Stoics are very much. They are very concerned about the right training, how a person can train him or herself towards a completely rational perception of the external impressions. But it's all a question of the right kind of cognitive attitude. There is not much feeling. Not much feelings are not discussed that much. I mean, there are good feelings as opposed to the passions, the good feelings that kind of correspond to the passions. Like fear is a bad passion, but caution is a good feeling in some ways even. But it's not psychological in the kind of modern Freudian sense of the word, that you know, working out conflicts that one has. For the Stoics, it was more a rational fending off of the wrong impressions.
Okay. So there are two questions that I have that are left for you then. The first question is how you contrast the allegorical commentary with the questions and answers, and you get into this in, I think, in a little bit more detail in your other book on Homeric exegesis, if I remember correctly. So the allegorical commentary, you argue, was written for a Jewish intellectual audience that might not have been so friendly to allegory, whereas the questions and answers, Philo assumes the implied readers are readers who are content with allegory and don't really have any problems with it. So Philo doesn't need to go into such great detail, because the questions and answers, they're very brief, and he doesn't really go into a lot of explanations. A thought that I had, because I always think about Origen, because that's what I do. There's an argument out there that On First Principles was written, it was an interruption of his commentary on Genesis, where Origen was receiving a lot of criticism, a lot of flack from his contemporaries, that he was allegorizing everything. And so he writes On First Principles to justify that. And I think that's actually a compelling argument. And I wonder if there might not be something similar in Philo, where he's writing the questions and answers for his students, and he receives a lot of criticism for his use of allegory. So then he writes his allegorical commentary for those critics, where he has to go into a lot more explanation. I don't know how, does that conflict with your argument? Are you saying more that he writes his allegorical commentary first and his questions and answers later? How would you situate those two chronologically?
Yeah, there is a controversy about this sequence of the allegorical commentary and the questions and answers. At the beginning of modern scholarship, it was the allegorical commentary was seen to come before the question and answers, and then my two friends, Abraham Terrian and Greg Sterling, have argued the other way around, that the questions and answers were some kind of notebook for the allegorical commentary, which then took the same materials and developed them a bit further. I have argued for the allegorical commentary first and the questions and answers second, because it often seemed to me that Philo is abbreviating in the questions and answers, that he has the kind of the full argument that he made in the allegorical commentary. He has it, I think, clearly in the back of his mind, and he is giving a summary. Now, the argument that you have just proposed is very interesting. I haven't heard it about Philo. So you are kind of asking a question from origin to Philo, and that's very interesting.
It's not historically responsible.
No, but it's potentially very fruitful, because this is obviously a question that is really important to ask, whether we have evidence that Philo may have worked in the same way. Now, first of all, there is no sign that he kind of interrupted the question, the writing of the question and answers, because he very often, as Greg Sterling has shown very meticulously, he refers back to his previous treatise, and he kind of resumes his work, and he seems to work quite steadily. And on the whole, I see Philo as getting excited about a particular project and then kind of doing it, rather than working on multiple different projects at the same time, because he seems to quite consistently refer back, in the biographies, he refers back what he has just written about the other patriarch. And so he kind of, and in the allegorical commentaries, he refers back and forth. So it seems to me that he is rather consistent in his work on a particular series once he gets into it. And in the questions and answers, the audience seems to be very much with him. They all seem to be all enthusiastic about allegory, and he mentions many more allegorical interpreters on a particular verse than he does in the allegorical commentary. So I don't see any signs there that people were unhappy with what he did. He seems to me to be preaching to a convinced crowd who were eager to use his work, maybe also for liturgical purposes on Shabbat in the synagogue. So they have this handbook, and they could look up particular verses to see what Philo had to say on them. And I think that probably he wrote the questions and answers when he was already a successful teacher, and he had in fact convinced many people of his points in the allegorical commentary. And in the allegorical commentary, he's also often hesitant, and he says, if you don't like this allegorical interpretation, then don't hold it against Moses. It's my fault. I didn't formulate the argument well enough. So it's clear that he is approaching here a very specialized audience of Jewish Bible exegetes who are not kind of predisposed to allegory, and he works very hard to convince them that it's not that it is not an arbitrary method, but it was in fact already implied by Moses himself.
Right, very good. Okay. Now, the last question, I want you to bring us home. What is Philo's legacy?
That's of course a difficult question. We have relatively little evidence from Origen, from Clement of Alexandria, from Ambrosius, and from Eusebius. They are our main sources for direct, extensive direct quotations and use. Of course, David Runya has written an important book about the reception of Philo among all the different Christian authors, and he has collected there not only direct quotations, but also allusions or possible allusions, and really has tried to make the best case for Philo being known in the different schools. I guess the big question for me is whether pagan authors knew him. Somebody like Plutarch, who actually speaks very positively about Jews, who was congenial in terms of his philosophy and biographical interest, whether he may have read Philo. But we don't really know. I'm also intrigued to know whether Epictetus, who also wrote a treatise from a more distinctly Stoic perspective, but he also wrote a treatise on freedom, just like Philo. And so I'm very intrigued to figure out whether perhaps there is any sign that Epictetus knew Philo. The case has been made for Numenius. Greg Sterling has argued that Numenius may well have known Philo. Porphyry, of course, is another candidate. And in all of these authors, we are on more slippery grounds because they don't say that they read Philo. So I would, I think at this point, unless we find some new manuscripts, I think probably a more fruitful way to proceed here is to ask how Philo can in fact help us to analyze all these other authors, because I think he can contribute to our understanding of the ancient world, both pagan and Christian, Greek and Roman, in so many ways, without having to postulate that he was read and quoted and directly used. But he is such an incredible indicator of the ideas that moved the first century, and such an incredible innovative mind who really proposed so many new ideas that we see later reflected in so many other authors, each putting their particular lens on it. That I think it is probably much more fruitful to think about the legacy of Philo in those terms. And as I said before, I think we can learn so much about Paul by reading Philo. I have no way of proving, and I'm not even interested in proving, that Paul necessarily read Philo. That's not my argument, but my argument is that you should in fact read Philo to understand Paul, because they were engaging in very similar topics at almost the same time in the same kind of circumstances. And Philo wrote so much more than Paul did, and made so many points more in a more explicit manner than Paul did, that we can learn a lot from his numerous clear discussions and often direct quotations of other people that may in fact all be in the background of Paul in one way or the other, and he is formulating his worldview and I think we can often unlock the riddles of other authors by looking at Philo. And perhaps the same argument could even be made with Plutarch, who also does not mention Philo explicitly. But in my work on the Probus, I have been dealing with two highly political figures who are mentioned in the Probus. One is Alexander and the other is Caesar, Julius Caesar. And on both of these heroes, obviously, Plutarch wrote extensively. He has a life on Caesar and he has a life of Alexander. Interestingly, on both of these figures, central figures in the first century, they come up as the complete opposites. They come out as complete opposites. Plutarch likes Alexander and dislikes Caesar, and Philo likes Caesar and mocks Alexander. Now, the interesting question for me is whether in some of the rather apologetic formulations that you find in Plutarch's Life of Alexander, where he kind of deals with exactly the same issues that Philo has brought up, whether there's any possibility that perhaps Plutarch is reacting not only to Philo, but perhaps also to the kind of arguments that Philo brought up against Alexander. Plutarch is actually making a statement very forcefully to kind of protect Alexander against the kind of criticism that Philo and of course many others were voicing in the first century. So here again, without any pretense that we can prove a direct connection, I think it is extremely worthwhile reading Plutarch together with Philo, because it becomes much more clear why Plutarch is stressing this particular point so much with regard to Alexander, and vice versa. When you read Philo's very kind of real praise of Caesar, and you can see what kind of criticism he was up against. Plutarch often preserves earlier sources about Caesar, and Philo also speaks there about Brutus, the assassin of Caesar, whom of course he dislikes and Plutarch likes. And again, you can see here that Philo's image is modeled, partly at least, against the kind of materials that Plutarch brings up a generation later in a positive manner. And so I think if we change the focus and do not necessarily ask about direct dependence, but about the kind of participation in discourses. So we see different authors participating in very similar discourses, and they kind of pull at different ends, but you see that they were concerned about the same issues and they solved them in different ways. And I think Philo has absolutely not been used enough to illuminate all these different discourses in the first century. And I think he has a lot to contribute and can in fact kind of open up early Christianity and open up the emergence of the second sophistic in the first century with Plutarch, and the Romanization, the incredibly profound Romanization that all of Greek culture went through. I think Philo is a key really to these processes. And so I think that he should be used far more than he has been used so far.
What about the rabbis, like the Palestinian rabbis? Is there any evidence that they were familiar with Philo?
I would say so, because we know that his works were available in Caesarea. Origen had brought them to Caesarea, and a huge factor that has not been considered yet in rabbinic scholarship is the fact that we have in Caesarea and also in other centers in late antique Palestina, we have in fact really important Jewish Hellenistic communities who were thriving in the 3rd and 4th centuries in the land of Israel. So when we ask the question whether the rabbis perhaps knew the works of Philo, the question has to be kind of reformulated to see whether Hellenistic Jews living in the land of Israel were perhaps using Philo, and whether this may have been a source of discourse or maybe debate with the rabbis, and whether there was any a kind of a triangular discussion between Origen, Hellenistic Jews, and the rabbis in Caesarea, who may all have had access to Philo's works in the library there. And they may have had quite heated debates how to interpret him and how to relate to his allegorical interpretations. But this is still something that has to be explored. And in fact, I just received a new grant from the Israel Science Foundation exactly to explore these kind of questions. It's a project on Hellenistic Judaism in late antique Palestina, and I'm hoping to reconstruct from fragments and from a juxtaposition of all the available sources, rabbinic and Christian and material and all sources that I can think of, to reconstruct these Hellenistic Jewish communities, which have not left us books like Philo or like the rabbinic sources or like Origen's sources. They kind of, at some point, they simply fell between all the chairs and they didn't become canonical for any community. And so nobody copied their works. But I have made it my task and my responsibility to try and see whether nevertheless we can actually, between all the other authors that are still available from that period, whether we can juxtapose them in a manner that allows us to reconstruct some of their ideas. And one of the big questions, of course, is whether Philo was part of that culture, and it's quite likely that he was, but we don't at this point, at least, I cannot say anymore.
Well, it sounds like a very fascinating research project, and maybe there's somebody who can do a postdoc over there with you and participate in this research. I don't know who that might be. Well, Dr. Niehoff, thank you very much for coming back on Patristicast to talk about this wonderful and very interesting first century philosopher Philo. Thank you very much.
Bye.